James Carson's hands trembled violently as he stared at the document in front of him, the words blurring together into an impossible reality. $87.6 billion. The number was so large it stopped making sense, like trying to count stars or measure the ocean. His throat constricted, breathing became difficult, and for a moment he thought he might actually pass out right there in Philip Hastings's pristine Manhattan office. "I don't understand," James whispered, his voice barely audible. "This has to be a mistake. My mother was a librarian. She took the subway to work every single day for 40 years. Philip Hastings, the silver-haired attorney sitting across from him, leaned forward with an expression that mixed sympathy and something else, respect, maybe, or admiration. "Your mother was many things, Mr. Carson. A librarian, yes, but also the founder and sole owner of Meridian Global Properties, one of the largest private real estate empires in the world. She built it over 4 decades in absolute secrecy, and now it's yours." James shook his head, unable to process the information. 3 weeks ago, he'd buried his mother in a small cemetery in Queens. 40 people had attended, library colleagues, a few neighbors, distant relatives he barely knew. His wife, Claire, had spent the entire funeral checking her phone. His best friend, Michael, had left early, claiming a work emergency. And now this attorney was telling him that his coupon-clipping, subway-riding mother had secretly been one of the wealthiest people in America. "This can't be real," James said. But even as he spoke, he was looking at the evidence. Property portfolios spanning 43 countries, thousands of buildings, tens of thousands of leases, all documented in meticulous detail. Philip opened another folder, his movements careful and deliberate. "Your mother left you a letter. She wanted me to give it to you after I explained the basics. Perhaps it will help you understand." But before James could reach for the letter, his mind catapulted back to 3 weeks earlier, to the moment everything had started to fracture. The funeral had been small and sad, rain falling softly on the handful of mourners gathered around his mother's grave. James had stood there feeling hollowed out, barely aware of his surroundings. Claire had been beside him in an expensive black dress he didn't remember her buying, her phone clutched in her manicured hand. Across the small gathering, Michael Torres had also been distracted, constantly checking his watch. James had noticed them exchange a look, brief, furtive, intimate. Something had passed between his wife and his best friend that made his stomach clench with nameless dread. But grief had been too heavy, too consuming, for him to examine that look too closely. After the service, back at the modest Astoria apartment, Claire had packed an overnight bag with practiced efficiency. "I'm going to stay with my sister in Connecticut for a few days," she'd announced, not quite meeting his eyes. "You need space to grieve. Time alone." James had been grateful, touched even by what seemed like consideration. "Thank you. That's really thoughtful of you." He'd watched from the window as she'd gotten into a car. Not a taxi. Michael's black BMW. He'd seen her hand touch Michael's on the steering wheel, a gesture too familiar, too comfortable. And then they'd driven away together. His phone had buzzed moments later. Text from Michael. "Sorry I had to leave early. Man. Emergency at the farm. Here if you need anything. Stay strong." James had stared at that text for a long time, eyes spreading through his chest. He'd wanted to be wrong. Desperately wanted to misinterpret what he'd seen. But some truths announced themselves in quiet moments, in glances exchanged across gravesides, in lies texted from cars driving away. For 5 days, James had sorted through his mother's cramped apartment in Forest Hills, moving through rooms that suddenly felt like archaeological sites, each object a clue to a life he'd thought he understood. Everything was modest, worn, carefully maintained. Bookshelves crammed with library discards and yard sale finds. Furniture from the 80s that she'd refused to replace. Nothing suggested wealth. Nothing hinted at secrets. Then he'd found it, behind a false panel in her bedroom closet. A panel he discovered purely by accident when a shelf had collapsed. There was a small safe. Inside, a key card, a business card, and an envelope with his name written in his mother's careful, familiar handwriting. The business card had read, "Philip Hastings, General Counsel, Meridian Global Properties, LLC." The note had been brief. "James, use a key card at 432 Park Avenue, 67th floor. You deserve to know the truth. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you while I was alive. All my love, Mom. James had stood outside 432 Park Avenue feeling like he'd stepped into someone else's life. The building was one of Manhattan's most exclusive addresses, a pencil-thin tower that pierced the sky like a monument to wealth. The key card had opened a private elevator that required biometric scanning. When he pressed his hand to the scanner, it had granted immediate access, recognizing him as authorized. The elevator had risen smoothly, silently, to the 6th to 7th floor. The doors had opened onto something impossible. A massive corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows framing Manhattan in 3 directions. A wall of screens displaying real-time data, property portfolios across 6 continents, financial markets, development projects, occupancy rates scrolling past in endless streams of information. Everything sleek, modern, powerful. On the desk, a nameplate. M. Carson, founder and CEO, Meridian Global Properties. James had walked through slowly, afraid to touch anything, feeling like an intruder in his own inheritance. He'd found a hidden drawer behind a false panel in the desk, and inside were photographs his mother had never displayed. Margaret Carson at groundbreakings in Dubai, the desert sun harsh behind her, shaking hands with mayors, governors, foreign dignitaries at ribbon-cutting ceremonies, accepting industry awards in evening gowns James had never seen her wear. A completely separate life documented in secret, hidden from everyone who thought they knew her. Now, sitting in Philip Hastings's office, James opened the letter with shaking hands. His mother's voice seemed to rise from the page, and he could hear her speaking every word as he read. "My dearest James, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you found what I spent your entire life hiding from you. I'm so sorry for the deception, but I need you to understand why I did this. I built Meridian before you were born, started with one apartment building in the Bronx that nobody wanted. I was 23 years old and had nothing but ambition and a willingness to work harder than anyone else. I turned that one building into an empire, but along the way, I watched what extreme wealth did to people. I saw families destroyed by inheritance battles, children raised without purpose, without character, ruined by money they didn't earn and didn't understand. I wanted something different for you. I wanted you to know genuine friendship, real love, honest work. I wanted you to build character before you inherited capital. I was going to tell you on your 35th birthday. I didn't make it that far. The team at Meridian is exceptional. Trust Philip Hastings completely. He'll guide you through everything. But James, listen to me carefully. This fortune is a tool, not an identity. It's power, and power reveals character. It doesn't create it. Use it wisely. Stay kind. Don't let it corrupt the man I raised. You were always my greatest achievement, not the buildings, not the billions. I love you more than all of this could ever be worth. Be good, my son. Be better than the world expects billionaires to be. Mom." James sat in silence, the letter trembling in his hands. Rain began to fall outside, drops racing down the enormous windows. Manhattan glittered below him, a city his mother had secretly owned piece by piece, and he'd never known. "Take your time," Philip said gently. "This is overwhelming. Your mother knew it would be." But James couldn't take time, because even as he sat in this office, processing an inheritance beyond comprehension, another betrayal was unfolding in his modest Astoria apartment. That evening, James returned home late, his mind still reeling from everything Philip had shown him. The lights were on. Claire had returned early from Connecticut, and she was packing suitcases in the bedroom with an efficiency that suggested she'd done this before, perhaps in her mind many times. "We need to talk," James said from the doorway, his voice steadier than he felt. Claire didn't turn around, continued folding expensive clothes he didn't remember buying for her. "About what?" "About Michael. About whatever's been happening between you two." Claire's hands stilled. She turned slowly, and something in her face shifted like a mask being removed. The concerned wife disappeared, replaced by someone cold and calculating, someone James suddenly realized he'd never really known. "Fine," she said, her voice sharp and impatient. "Yes, Michael and I have been seeing each other. For 20 months. We're in love, James. I was going to wait until after things settled down from your mother's death. I wanted to be respectful about the timing." The casual cruelty of it hit James like a physical blow, stealing his breath. 20 months? We celebrated our anniversary 6 months ago. You stood in that restaurant and told me you'd never been happier. Claire's laugh was harsh, brittle. What did you expect, James? You're a librarian. You make $38,000 a year. You have no ambition, no prospects, no future. Michael is partner track at a corporate law firm. He's opening his own practice next year. He's going places. You're going nowhere, and I'm tired of going nowhere with you. He's my best friend, James said quietly, and hated how small his voice sounded. He was your best friend. Now he's mine. Claire closed her suitcase with a decisive zip. Look, we'll make this easy. I'll file for divorce. New York is no fault. We'll split whatever little you have, and we can all move on with our lives like adults. James felt something cold and hard settle in his chest, something that felt almost like power. Whatever little I have. You inherited your mother's apartment, right? It's probably worth $400,000, maybe $500 in this market. We'll split it 50-50. I'm not trying to take you for everything, James. I'm actually being generous considering I wasted 5 years of my life on this marriage. A key turned in the front door. Michael Torres entered carrying takeout bags, completely comfortable, completely at home in the apartment James paid for with his modest salary. He saw James and froze, but only for a second. Oh, James, I didn't know you'd be home. Claire said you were at your mother's place. Look, man, I didn't want you to find out like this. Claire crossed to Michael and took his hand. They stood together, a united front, comfortable with their betrayal in a way that made James's stomach turn. How long have you had a key to my apartment? James asked, his voice eerily calm. Michael had the grace to look uncomfortable. A few months. It just made things easier when you were sleeping with my wife in my bed, James finished. Claire rolled her eyes. Don't be dramatic. You're making this harder than it needs to be. James looked at them both. These two people he trusted more than anyone except his mother. A week ago, this betrayal would have destroyed him completely. But standing in his mother's office, reading her letter, touching the evidence of a secret empire had changed something fundamental. He'd learned that appearances could be deceiving, that quiet people could hold enormous power, that the world was far more complex than he'd imagined. You're right, James said, his voice calm and controlled. Let's make this easy. I'll have my attorney contact yours to begin divorce proceedings. Claire looked relieved, almost happy. Good. Be reasonable about the apartment, and this will be painless for everyone. My attorney's name is Philip Hastings, James said, watching their faces carefully. He's with a firm in Midtown. Michael frowned. Never heard of him. Is he with a small practice? James allowed himself a small, cold smile. You could say he specializes in complex estates. I'm sure you'll hear from him soon. Over the next 3 months, James lived in 2 worlds simultaneously. In one world, he was still the modest librarian, arriving at the Queen's Public Library at 6 every morning to shelve books and help patrons. In the other world, he was learning to command an empire worth more than most countries' GDP. Philip Hastings introduced him to the executive team his mother had assembled. Dr. Naomi Richards, the chief financial officer, was a brilliant woman in her early 40s who spoke about asset allocation strategies with the precision of a surgeon. Your mother's genius was patience, Naomi explained during one late-night session. She bought properties other developers ignored, held them for decades, let them appreciate naturally. No speculation, no gambling, just research, patience, and perfect timing. Robert Kingston, the chief operating officer and former Marine, ran operations with military precision. Every property, every lease, every contract is documented and defensible, he told James during a tour of Meridian's operations center. Your mother built this like a fortress. Nothing happens without paper trails and redundancies. Jennifer Wu, the VP of Development, walked James through projects across 12 countries. Your mother had a vision, Jennifer said, showing him plans for mixed-use developments that prioritize community impact alongside profit. She believed wealth should create more wealth, yes, but also more opportunity for others. James absorbed everything like a student cramming for the most important exam of his life. He studied property law, finance, international markets. He toured Meridian-owned buildings across New York, talking to tenants and maintenance staff. He sat in board meetings taking notes while executives presented quarterly reports. And slowly, gradually, he began to understand the enormity of what his mother had built and the responsibility she'd passed to him. But he kept working at the library. Every morning, he'd arrive in his cardigan and khakis, shelve books, help patrons find information, read to children during story hour. His colleagues noticed he seemed different, somehow more confident, more settled, but they attributed it to grief processing. "You don't have to keep this job anymore," Jennifer Wu told him one morning, observing him leave for the library. "You own buildings in 12 countries. You could retire 10,000 times over." James had smiled, adjusting his cardigan over the expensive suit he'd wear to Meridian later. "My mother worked at that library for 40 years while running all of this. If she could balance both worlds, so can I. Besides, that job keeps me grounded. Reminds me who I am underneath everything else." Philip Hastings had overheard and nodded approvingly. "Your mother would be very proud." Meanwhile, Claire had filed for divorce with confidence bordering on arrogance. She'd hired Richard Morrison, an expensive attorney known for aggressive tactics in high-net-worth divorces. The discovery phase had been scheduled for 3 months after the funeral, giving James time to learn his new reality before facing his old one. The morning of the discovery meeting, James dressed carefully in one of his new tailored suits. He looked different now. Better haircut, better posture, the unmistakable bearing of someone who commanded real power. But underneath, he was still the librarian who'd been betrayed, and that pain hadn't diminished even slightly. The meeting took place in a conference room in Lower Manhattan. Claire sat confidently next to Richard Morrison, who wore an expensive suit and an expensive watch and had expensive confidence radiating from every pore. Michael sat beside Claire, no longer hiding their relationship, his hand resting possessively on her knee. Across the table sat James with Philip Hastings and 2 associate attorneys, all carrying identical leather folders. Richard Morrison leaned forward with practiced aggression. "Let's cut to the chase, gentlemen. New York is an equitable distribution state. My client is entitled to full financial disclosure and her fair share of all marital assets. We expect complete transparency." Philip Hastings nodded with pleasant agreement. "Of course. We prepared comprehensive documentation of Mr. Carson's financial position." He slid a folder across the table. Richard Morrison opened it with a confident smirk of a man who expected to see a modest apartment and maybe some small savings. His expression shifted from confidence to confusion to absolute shock in the span of 5 seconds. "This documentation indicates your client is the sole owner and CEO of Meridian Global Properties," he said slowly, as if speaking a foreign language. "That's correct," Philip replied mildly. "The Meridian Global Properties." Richard's voice rose slightly. "The real estate company that owns half of Midtown Manhattan. Among other holdings, 43 countries, to be precise. Total valuation as of this morning, $87.6 billion. The room went absolutely silent. Claire, who had been sitting with smug confidence, stared at James like he'd transformed into a completely different species. Her mouth opened and closed wordlessly. Michael had gone pale, his hand sliding off Claire's knee as he processed the impossible numbers. Philip pulled out another document with the precision of a surgeon making an incision. Mr. Carson inherited 100% ownership of Meridian Global Properties upon his mother's death. Under New York State domestic relations law, inherited assets are classified as separate property, not marital property. They are not subject to equitable distribution in divorce proceedings. "You knew?" Claire hissed, finding her voice finally. "You've known for 3 months, and you let me file for divorce thinking you had nothing. You played me." James met her gaze steadily. "I didn't play you, Claire. I didn't know about any of this when you told me you wanted a divorce. My mother died, and you told me about Michael in the same week. I found out about the inheritance 2 days after you moved in with him. I spent the last 3 months learning how to manage a responsibility I never asked for while processing the fact that my wife and my best friend betrayed me in the cruelest way possible. So you've been sitting on this information for months." Her voice was shrill now, all pretense of dignity abandoned. "Watching us? Playing games." "No games," James said quietly. I've been learning how to honor my mother's legacy and trying to understand how the two people I trusted most in the world could do what you did. Richard Morrison, recovering his professional composure, leaned forward. We'll challenge the classification. The inheritance occurred during the marriage. Our client has rights to marital appreciation of assets. No, Philip interrupted, his pleasant tone vanishing like smoke. She doesn't. The inheritance occurred 3 weeks after your client informed Mr. Carson of her intention to divorce. 3 weeks after she and Mr. Torres began openly cohabiting. We have documentation of everything, the timeline, the affair, the circumstances. Your challenge will fail spectacularly, and you know it. The courthouse hallway 1 week later was cold and echoing. Claire stormed toward James, her heels clicking on marble like gunshots. Michael trailed behind her, looking smaller somehow, diminished. You lied to me, Claire spat, her perfectly made-up face twisted with rage and something that looked almost like grief. You let me think you were poor. You watched me leave you. You played me like a fool. James turned to face her calmly, and in that moment, he realized the pain of a betrayal had transformed into something else. Not hatred, but a kind of sad clarity. I didn't lie, Claire. I was exactly who you thought I was, a librarian making $38,000 a year. The money doesn't change that. What it changed was revealing who you really are. We don't have to do this, Claire said, her voice shifting, becoming softer, almost seductive. We can work it out, cancel the divorce, start over. We can travel, buy anything we want. I made a mistake, but we can fix this. James studied her face, the same face he'd loved for 5 years, now twisted with transparent greed and calculation. You told me I had no ambition, no prospects, no future. You were disgusted by what you thought I was. That's who you are, Claire. The money doesn't change that truth. Michael stepped forward, trying to salvage something from the wreckage. James, come on. We go back to freshman year at NYU. We were roommates, best friends. Don't let money destroy a friendship that meant something. James looked at Michael, really looked at him, seeing past the expensive suit to the man who'd studied beside him, who'd been his best man, who'd eaten countless pizzas in a terrible East Village apartment. You destroyed our friendship 20 months ago when you started sleeping with my wife, Michael. Money has absolutely nothing to do with it. You made a choice. You chose her over me, comfort over loyalty, ambition over character. That's on you, not on some number in a bank account. 2 months later, Manhattan Supreme Court was cold and formal. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, delivered her ruling with a detachment of someone who'd seen every variation of human greed and betrayal. Having reviewed all evidence, documentation, and arguments, this court finds that Meridian Global Properties and all associated assets constitute separate property inherited by Mr. Carson after the irretrievable breakdown of this marriage. Mrs. Carson is entitled to equitable distribution of marital assets accumulated during the marriage, specifically the marital residence in Astoria and joint bank accounts totaling $43,000. She is not entitled to any portion of the inherited estate. Divorce granted. The gavel fell with finality. Claire sat rigid, her face white with shock and fury. Michael put a hand on her shoulder. She shrugged it off violently. In the courthouse lobby, James overheard them arguing, their voices carrying in the vast marble space. It's okay, Michael was saying. My practice is doing well. We'll be fine. We have each other. That's what matters. Claire turned on him with savage fury. Your practice? Michael, we just lost access to $8 to $7 billion. Do you understand that number? 8 to 7 billion. With AB. I thought you loved me, Michael said quietly, and James could hear genuine pain in his voice. I loved what you represented, Claire said coldly. Success, ambition, a future better than some pathetic librarian's tiny life. Turns out that librarian owned half of Manhattan. Do you understand how catastrophically you miscalculated? She walked away, her heels echoing. Michael stood alone, finally understanding that he'd been a pawn in someone else's game, used and discarded just like James had been. 15 months later, James sat in his mother's office, definitively his office now. The transformation was complete. Tailored suit, confident posture, comfortable commanding a room full of executives. But his mother's photographs sat prominently on the desk, and stacks of children's books were piled on a side table, waiting for his afternoon reading session at the library. Dr. Naomi Richards entered with a tablet. The City Council approved the Bronx project. 500 units, 30% designated affordable housing for teachers, healthcare workers, and public servants. Rent control for 20 years. Excellent, James said. What about the literacy initiative? Robert Kingston appeared in the doorway. Approved. 50 new library branches in underserved neighborhoods across the city. Full operational funding for 15 years, no strings attached. Your mother would love this. James smiled, checking his watch. I need to go. Children's reading hour at the Queen's Library in 40 minutes. Can't be late. His team smiled. They'd come to respect this about him, the way he refused to let wealth separate him from the work that made him who he was. Walking through Midtown that afternoon, James passed one of his office towers. Outside a Starbucks, he spotted them, Claire and Michael at an outdoor table. They looked tired, strained. Their clothes were nice but not designer. Middle-class comfortable. Nothing more. Michael saw James first and tapped Claire's arm. She turned, her expression hardening instantly. James could have walked past, should have walked past, but something made him stop. Claire, Michael, how are you both? Claire's laugh was bitter as winter. How do you think we are? Michael shifted uncomfortably. We're managing. My practice hit some obstacles. Turns out I'm better at corporate law than entrepreneurship. I'm back at Silverman and Roth as an associate. I'm sorry to hear about the difficulties, James said, and meant it. Are you? Claire's voice dripped sarcasm. You could help. You have more money than you could spend in 100 lifetimes. You could write a check and never notice it was gone. I could, James agreed, but that wouldn't help either of you. You need to build something real, something you earn, something that gives you purpose beyond accumulating wealth. That's what my mother taught me. He started to walk away, then paused and turned back to Michael. There's an opening at the Queen's Public Library. Reference librarian position. $4,000 to $2,000 a year. If you're interested, I can put in a word. Michael stared at him in shock. Why would you do that for me? James considered the question carefully. Because I remember who you were before you became who you are now. We studied together for the bar exam in that terrible East Village apartment. You helped me through my mother's first cancer scare. You were a good friend once. I believe people can find their way back to who they really are, but only if they are willing to do the hard work. At the Queen's Public Library that afternoon, James sat on the floor surrounded by children, reading Where the Wild Things Are with the same enthusiasm he'd had before his life changed. Parents watched from nearby chairs, having no idea the man in the cardigan and khakis was one of the wealthiest people in America. My mother left me $87.6 billion and one of the world's largest real estate empires, James thought. But that's not what she really gave me. She gave me 34 years without corruption, values before valuations, the ability to see people for who they really are, not what they are worth. I'm a billionaire now. I manage properties in 43 countries. I make decisions affecting thousands of lives. But 4 mornings a week, I come to this library. I sell books. I help patrons. I read to children. Because money didn't make me who I am. My mother did. And honoring her legacy means staying exactly who she raised me to be, a librarian who happens to have resources to do extraordinary good. Claire and Michael taught me that some people only see value in bank accounts. But my mother taught me that real value is measured in character, in kindness, in what you build with integrity. I didn't lose anything when they left. I found myself. I found my purpose. The camera pulls back slowly, showing James surrounded by children, engaged and present. Through the library windows, Manhattan's skyline glitters in the distance. A city his mother owned piece by piece, now is the steward. But hey, in this moment, he's just a librarian reading to kids who don't care about billions, only about stories. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to True Spark Stories for more tales about transformation, hidden truths, and the power of character over circumstance. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community around the world. Your engagement helps these stories reach people who need to hear them. James Carson continues to serve as CEO of Meridian Global Properties. He works at the Queens Public Library 4 days a week. Michael Torres accepted the reference librarian position and is slowly rebuilding his life with honesty. Claire Donovan remarried within a year. They don't speak. Some betrayals don't heal, but some people do. Thank you for being part of True Spark Stories. Your love and support mean more than words. Jointly, we are spreading sparks of light one whisper at a time.